for the herds that haven't been exposed, we certainly want to be careful with the bioexclusion and continue to make sure that we're doing everything we can there. And for the herds that have turned positive, we want to work on the biocontainment and make sure that we're not carrying that virus around to places we don't want it. And so I think those are important factors. I think as you, if you've had a positive herd and had a break, then working your way back to getting the field virus out of the herd is an important piece, and just continuing to use the tools we have to help monitor.
Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Greiner, your host for today's Swine It podcast. And with me today, I have Dr. Paul Yeske from Swine Vet Center. How are you today, Paul?
Doing well. Enjoying the cool weather.
Yes. Maybe a little too cool for us, but...
Yeah, it's actually cool. But
yes, exactly. Well, it's a pleasure to have you on today. And I know we just kind of caught up at Iowa Congress, but I think this is really a great opportunity for us to visit today and talk about some things that we do think about when it's this cold, when it's wintertime. And that'll be PRRS, of course, which is a big topic for everybody. But before I jump into that, maybe I'll have you give a little bit of an introduction to the audience in case there are some who aren't familiar with you. Sure.
I'm Paul Yeske from the Swine Vet Center in St. Peter, Minnesota. We have a swine only practice where we just do pigs, and we have 15 veterinarians in the practice, and we work primarily in the Midwest, with the majority of the work being in Iowa, Minnesota, and Iowa, but throughout the Midwest. So we unfortunately get to have our share of exposure and exposure to PRRS over the course of time, just based upon geography.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think I know you've done some work in the past, a lot of work actually in PRRS and different parts of that in terms of exposures and wean to finish management, as well as in the sows. So I think maybe we'll start with just kind of where are we at today? We're midwinter. What are we seeing? What are we hearing in terms of the first migration, strains, et cetera?
Sure. Yep. And things kind of started as we got into November, and we started seeing more activity in November and kind of heated up through December. And as we got into some of the colder weather here in January, seems to have leveled off a little bit. So hopefully we can knock on some wood and hope that continues. But oftentimes that's what we've seen. It started out as we look at the Morrison Swine Health Monitoring Project, showed a real steep slope through that time frame. And the Morrison Swine Health Project is looking at reported disease outbreaks. And so that's sow farms, and they're reporting that they're seeing clinical signs. And so that's what that database tells us. And Iowa State also does the swine disease reporting service. And in that report, they're looking at diagnostic data. And so they're using the information coming through the diagnostic lab. So it's somewhat biased to the cases coming to the diagnostic lab because they're reporting on what's happening. But they're showing a similar type trend where the numbers really went up. And the interesting thing with the SDRS report is that it breaks it down into various age ranges. So they have wean to market and sows. And what we've been seeing over the last 4 years is that the wean to market, we see that leading about 1 month ahead of the sows. And so we saw that going up at the end of September, October, and then the sows followed along in November, December. And so, again, those two things kind of happening at the same time, as well as influenza. And so the nice thing about the SDRS is they're also monitoring other diseases, and it showed that influenza was going up in the same time frame. And so I think those things all correlate well. And I think the Morrison Swine Health Monitoring Project and the SDRS together give us a real good look at the industry in a couple different ways. What I like about it is we got two different tools giving us similar answers. And so one's reported, one's diagnostic data. They each have their biases, but they're telling us kind of the same thing and telling us that trend is up. Fortunately, as we look at the SDRS, it looks like we've kind of turned that corner down. And the same thing on the Morrison Swine Health Monitoring Project kind of leveled out. And so hopefully as we go on into winter now, we won't see as much activity, but there's certainly been enough.
Yes. And so if we compare that to other years, do you kind of have an idea of where we're at in terms of pigs affected by PRRS this year? I know some years we say it's more PRRS heavy than other years, and I haven't really heard the status yet for this year.
Yeah, I'd say we're about on track for where we've been in previous years. What I'd say, if we look at both those reports, they would tell us that those curves are continuing to move up over time. So we're having more herds spend more time being positive. Whether you look at the SDRS or whether you look at the Morrison Swine Health Monitoring Project, both those are telling us we're having, and particularly on the Morrison Swine Health Monitoring Project, we're seeing more herds live in that ASV category 1, which would be PRRS active. And so that area of red under the curve continues to stay redder. And we used to see it be more seasonal and fluctuate up and down, but now we're seeing more herds stay there. And so I think it's just telling us there's some more activity and more ongoing activity over time. And so I think that's a part of what we're seeing across the industry. And the 144 L1C, certainly has continued to be the most frequent one when we look on the SDRS report as far as what's the most frequent cut pattern. There's a 142 L1C, again, similar, starting to show up, and it's also being very, very similar clinically to the 144. So they're not that far apart genetically, and they're acting fairly similarly from clinical standpoint. So it's just telling us that the virus is continuing to shift and mutate, and so continuing to try to avoid the immune system and what we're trying to do to prevent it.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you mention clinical signs, what are the common clinical signs for this strain population? I know some years it's more sow mortality, some years it's piglets. What are we seeing in terms of clinicals here?
It's still showing us what we typically see for PRRS. Usually we'll see it as abortions first. Abortions to high pre-weaning mortality kind of depends upon where it shows up in the farm. But I'd say typically we see it animals off feed, abortions, and then we'll see the stillborns, mummies tend to follow. And so the pre-weaning mortality, with these particular strains, the pre-weaning mortalities have been fairly significant. And the abortion rate may vary from herd to herd, may vary a little bit on previous exposure, if there's some immunity in the sow farm or no immunity in the sow farm. And it varies from herd to herd. We did a comparison on 144 L1Cs, and we looked at 10 different herds, and they certainly had different production outcomes. And so there's some variation in herds, even with similar type viruses. So there's always that herd-to-herd component, but certainly what we've seen again here is some of the more where we see the abortions and then followed up by the high pre-weaning mortality. The piglet diarrhea leads to high pre-weaning mortality. And then the herds do tend to stabilize, or the herds will stabilize over time. And then we get back to where we're farrowing good pigs and increased number of mummies for about that 12-week period of time after the outbreak. And then we see the total born dip off for about that next 4 weeks. And then we get back to the animals that were bred after the outbreak. And so we see the high number of mummies, then the lower total born. Those were mummies that were just lost before they could be mummified. So it's total born lost before they could be mummified. So that it's really a similar trend. But then once we get through that time frame, those herds will rebound back to normal.
Okay. So maybe let's talk a little bit now about what do we do if we have a break? So, or maybe we'll go one step for that. Let's talk about how we prevent a break.
There you go.
What are some common practices that we could do to try to prevent or potentially mitigate if we do have a PRRS infection, to kind of mitigate that viral clinical signs that we might see in the virus?
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly, biosecurity is a term that everybody's aware of. And as we think about biosecurity for me lives in two components. And the one that everyone's used to thinking about is the bioexclusion. How do we keep it out? And I'll talk a little bit about the other hand as biocontainment once you have an outbreak. But the bioexclusion is certainly the one that everybody thinks about, and being able to reduce our opportunities to bring the pathogen in. And I think Dr. Holkamp has with his PRRS outbreak investigations, has done a good job of defining what really takes three mistakes. We have to have the pathogen present, we have to take it to the farm, and then we have to introduce it to the pigs. And so there's three things that have to happen. It's not as simple as one. And so as we go back to look at those things, what are the mitigation steps we can put in place to avoid it if it comes to the farm? And then if it has come to the farm, how do we keep it from the pigs? And so I think going back and reviewing some of those things, certainly the bench procedures, I think, is a technology that we can use throughout both on the sow farms and on the grow finish. I think it's practical there. On the grow finish, where sometimes showers aren't always, but I think the bench technology is something that can be done and can be done without, we just have to have the resources there to be able to do it. The coveralls and boots to put on once we cross the bench, and to make sure that we leave those things in the farm. And so, again, I think those are opportunities for us from that bioexclusion. Certainly the ultimate bioexclusion is to have the filtration. And we know that that's not perfect. We know there's still outbreaks, but there's certainly a lot less frequent events. Even with some of these newer strains, we're seeing a good reduction in the number of outbreaks with the filters. So the filters still being effective, but with the higher viral numbers that these new strains are producing, it's making a little bit more opportunity for the viruses to get around our systems. And so, again, the filtration is probably the ultimate. It's not only the filters doing the job, but generally those farms have a very high level of execution on how they bring in products, how they load out procedures, and they have specific load out rooms and load out procedures to make sure that we're not getting contaminated in those processes. And again, those are, we could spend a couple hours talking about how to do it properly. But I do think there's some good information and background there that people can go take a look at. But that's kind of the ultimate bioexclusion package, where you have the filters to work on the air coming into the farm. We got to work on the products. We got to work on the people. We got to work on the products that are leaving the farm. The pigs, the pigs going out to the wean to finish, the mortalities going out to the composter, the garbage, all the things that have to come out of the farm. And so we have to make sure we've got a good plan and good execution around those to make sure we're controlling as much as we can. And if we don't have the opportunity to have filtration, for example, then trying to manage the immunity, utilizing vaccine, and trying to at least give ourselves some protection on those animals when they're going to see a strain, when they're going to see a field strain come in. And the field strain certainly is going to be a challenge even if we're vaccinated, but again, helps those herds to rebound better and quicker. I think the data would show that you return to baseline production a little faster, and so that's part of what you're trying to do is get back to baseline production. My bias is whenever we have these outbreaks is to work on trying to get the field virus back out of the farm and as relatively quickly as we can. We know that the herd closure has been a good method, and having the herd closure for that 210 plus days, oftentimes 240, where we load up the herd with as many animals as we can. We expose the herd, and then we spare our inventory to make sure we keep as many animals as we can through that closure time frame. And then monitoring the piglets with, we've got more tools today. The processing fluids, I think, help us know what's happening in the sow herd. And then also monitoring the wean pigs to know when they're going negative, because we've had situations where we get processing negative, but wean pigs positive, and it's staying in the farrowing house by some of the things we're doing in farrowing. And so that's how we can use those two tools together. A new tool that's come up and I'm kind of excited about, it's a little early. The tongue tips may be a way for us to monitor gestation. And by looking at those, gives us an idea what that status is in the gestating pigs if we look at the stillborns, because the stillborns give us a good look at that in utero as best we can. And I keep challenging the researchers to go back and figure out a better way to monitor gestation. And so hopefully we'll get some new tools there, but at least we got another tool to give us an idea of what we can do. If we're getting positive or negative processing fluids of positive weaning, in some cases we've done some wean downs. Gives you more time to clean up the rooms, less animals on site, and so some herds we've been able to break the cycle using that. And so there's multiple different ways to clean up, and each herd's going to have its own unique issues and concerns that have to be addressed. And so every plan kind of needs to be tailored to that specific herd and what the goals are of the system. But I think long-term, as an industry, we still want to get the field virus out of the herd, because we know that performance is better when we can get that out of the system and get the pigs back to performing more like we'd expect. One aspect of the biosecurity I talked about was biocontainment. And so when we have a positive herd, we oftentimes think of how to keep it out, but we also then, once we have it, we have to figure out how to not carry it somewhere else and keep it within the herd. And so making sure that we do the things that we can do internally to make sure we're not taking it downstream. How we handle the compost. We're going to be handling lots of mortalities in the outbreak time frame, and so we got to make sure that we clean up good after handling the compost, and not just jump in our vehicle and go home. Same thing with showering, making sure we shower out, change out, all those things. Same thing on wean to finish, as we discussed with the bench, making sure we don't carry it off the site. And so I think that's as important a factor as the bioexclusion. I think sometimes it gets lost in the shuffle with everything else just because we're trying to focus all on the bioexclusion. But we also have to focus on the biocontainment on the positive sites to make sure we're not moving it through the systems.
Yeah, it's very good. So I'm going to kind of back up a little bit in some of that conversation. You mentioned some new technology in gestation, and some people may not be familiar with what you're talking about. So maybe just describe it a little bit more in detail as to what that would be doing in terms of samples they would take and then what they would get for a measurement.
You bet. The tongue tips came from Europe, actually, where they don't have processing fluids because they don't castrate and they don't dock tails. And so they started collecting the tongue tips from the mortalities. And so they harvest the tongue from the mortality pigs. And one of the things we've looked at to try and sort that out a little bit more is to look at the stillborns to try and assess gestation status. And we can use the pre-weaning mortality pigs to kind of mirror up with processing fluids. And what we've seen in some of the initial research that Dr. Linares and his graduate student has been doing have told us that those two follow very closely. The mortality and the processing fluids have matched up well. Isadora's done her work there and showing that, and the stillborns are giving us a way to look at that end of gestation at least to know where those statuses are, and they're fairly easy samples to get once you get trained on how to collect them, and they're very similar. They act very similar to processing fluids. So you collect them in the bag. You get the fluid that comes. It works best to freeze them, and then you get the fluid that comes out of the cut surface tissue, and then you can go ahead and test that just like we do the processing fluids.
Okay, perfect. You also mentioned you want to get that virus through the herd as quickly as possible. And so I want to visit that for a moment. We can go through probably lots of conversation, and certainly longer than a half hour. But when we're talking about that, are we talking about implementing McRebel programs? Are we doing serum exposures? What types of procedures do you typically like to see done when we try to get that virus out of the herd quickly, besides locking down the facility?
Yeah, typically what we've done is to get as much inventory into the herd as we can, so we can maintain inventory, and then we do an exposure via the virus that's on site, and generally that would be through a serum exposure to the herd to get everybody standardized, and then once we've standardized, we lock the door or close the herd. And then we start using the diagnostics, and I think the processing fluids have been a good tool to tell us when we really need to be intense about our McRebel procedures. And so once we get to where we're getting negative processing fluids and they're starting to come through, then it's worthy to go ahead and start implementing those stricter McRebel procedures. And up until that time frame, we're probably better off to be saving pigs and at least get the pigs through the system that we can. And then once we get to the processing fluids are giving us the signals that it's time to work to see if we can get the virus out, then we can be more aggressive with the McRebel and work to push the virus off the farm. And so every herd's going to have its own timeline, and you can kind of follow the diagnostics to help that. Looking at the production records, I think Dr. Linares and their group, Giovanni's done some looking at different productivity parameters, and looking at those parameters have been helpful to say, yeah, it looks like the herd is stabilizing. We're returning to baseline. We're starting to see the conception rates come back. And so it's not the same as diagnostics, but at least tells you you're headed in the right direction. And so I think that's one of those tools that we can also use to say, yeah, it looks like we're headed to the right time frame. And that, along with your diagnostics, can tell you it's time to be more aggressive with the McRebel and try and push the virus off the farm. And then we may, depending upon how things go, may have to be more strict or less strict, depending upon the virus and the testing and the herd immunity. All those things are factors. And then we custom fit that to the farm, and then we work to get that out of the grow finish. And what you see on the wean to finish side is you'll see that that seroconversion, or the pigs turning positive, continue to move older and older as you get more stable. And so that's another sign that can tell you you're headed in the right direction. So if the pigs are crashing right away after weaning, you got a lot of virus. If you're waiting till the end of nursery, the virus is coming under control. You're getting less and less virus out of the system. And if it's hitting early finishing, you're very close to pushing it off the farm. And so those are some things that can also help you along with the diagnostics to know to feel like you're headed in the right direction.
Yes. Yeah, one of the other things that kind of pops into my mind too is, so we know people can move it within the barn and equipment. And so when we're trying to clean virus out, we have to be very careful of that. But what about the manure? Are there any current suggestions on how to handle manure management during that time when you're trying to clean out a farm?
Yep, it is a concern. I think we got to think about what's the highest risk animal we deal with. And so if the wean pigs are positive and the processing fluids are negative, every time we touch the wean pigs, we're handling the highest amount of virus on the farm pigs. And so we got to think about that. And so we'll oftentimes change loadout, have different coveralls, boots, wash our hands, clean up good after we wean, because everybody wants to wean right away in the morning and get that job done. And so we got to be careful there. But to get to your question, so I do think that washing down those hallways and handling those pigs is a way that we can, whether it's saliva, whether it's manure, however that's being shed, that's a way we can carry it around the farm. And so we know that in manure, it doesn't survive a real long time in the research work that's been done. And it's still a big question across the industry, but the research would say that it doesn't survive a long time in the manure, but it's always a question. And we try and avoid the contamination with the pits, certainly as we go through the cleanup process, and make sure we're doing plenty of washing and disinfecting along the way to just reduce those odds.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned that the herd closures are about 210 to 240 days. And so that's generally what we wait, about a month of having good negative samples throughout before we open that herd, or is that a different time frame than what I'm thinking?
Yeah, people have different rules. Some people use 3 monthly negative tests. Some people use 6 weekly negative tests, higher numbers. I think you just need to figure out what's worked for you in your system. And I think more time is your friend. And so more time negative is always good. And so the more time you can get, the better. The biggest challenge is maintaining herd inventory. And so that's one of the challenges that I would say over time has been the biggest concern is, if we've loaded up the herd and we get the inventory to where we're comfortable on inventory, then we've got a spare inventory. I'd like to call that Sal, but nope, she's going to get another litter because I need to have somebody in that place. And where I see herds get into trouble is they oftentimes they don't start that inventory sparing early enough. And once you're behind, you're behind and you can't catch up. And so I think that's one of the keys that have helped people be successful is just making sure they spare that inventory as they get to the end of the closure. Because we're talking about, we can load up the inventory, and sometimes that's easier in some herds than others because of space requirements. And when we talk about doing 8-month closure or 240 days, the pigs we need aren't even born for the gilts. And so it's kind of hard to save them when they're not even there. But you have to save some older ones. And you can skip some animals to fill those gaps. And again, sparing that inventory at the back end are some of the tools that can help make you through that process without necessarily hurting production a lot.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
it's probably never perfect.
No, it never is. But those are really great tips and tricks, I think, for conversation around PRRS and PRRS management, and certainly very timely for the time of year that we're going through. And again, I thank you for all of those key points. We're kind of wrapping up our time on the actual key topics. So maybe I'll ask you to summarize or give just a couple of quick take-home messages that you would like our audience to be thinking about.
Yeah, I think probably the most important thing is to continue to stay focused on the biosecurity, both for the herds that haven't been exposed. We certainly want to be careful with the bioexclusion and continue to make sure that we're doing everything we can there. And for the herds that have turned positive, we want to work on the biocontainment and make sure that we're not carrying that virus around to places we don't want it. And so I think those are important factors. I think as you, if you've had a positive herd and had a break, then working your way back to getting the field virus out of the herd is an important piece, and just continuing to use the tools we have to help monitor and give yourself some milestones to say, are we making progress or aren't we as we go forward? And then to help keep the morale in the system, because it can be kind of a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, perfect.
It is time to our famous three.
Well, Paul, thank you again for all that insight. One of the things we like to do as we wrap up our conversation is ask our speakers just a couple of questions that are common across everybody. The first question we like to ask is, do you have a swine resource that you would recommend to the listeners?
Yeah, I use a number of different resources, but I still go back to the Journal of Swine Health and Production for some of the more recent stuff. And amazingly, as many times as I come back to it, disease of swine is still a good reference. And so, but swine health and production would be where I'm looking for new trends and new things happening. And there's certainly lots of publications coming out. Like I talked about the Morrison Swine Health Monitoring Project, the STRS reports, all those things I think are good to give us a broad perspective of what's happening out in the industry, not just your backyard.
Right. Yeah, perfect. How about something that you would recommend to the audience that's not pig related? Are there any good books you're reading that you might want to share?
Yeah, I was at Iowa Pork and I went to the conference. I'd been reading the book and I went to the session on the trusted edge and the theory of trust. And so I think that's been it's enlightening to go ahead and think about. There's lots of good take-home messages, not only for work in the pig barns, but probably for our own lives as well. So,
yeah, very good. The last question we like to ask is, if you could think of somebody in your life that you have defined as successful, what would be a key trait that they possess that you think has allowed them to be successful?
Yeah, I think the people that communicate well certainly is a big part, and the ones that have lots of curiosity of asking questions and not being afraid to ask questions, not only of the people they work with, but their peers, and trying to always be in that learning mode and trying to understand as much as they can. And so I think the people that have that inquisitive nature and continue to ask lots of questions are always have always been able to do a good job.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We talk about the open mindset a lot, and we hear that from many of our speakers as well. So I think that is a very good trait to have to be successful, either in your job or in your life. So very good. Well, Dr. Yeske, I do want to thank you again for your time. For our listeners, again, this is Dr. Paul Yeske from the Swine Vet Center. Thank you again so much.
It was a pleasure to be with you this afternoon.
Imagine if, with a few key concepts, you could have the potential to create a massive positive impact by bringing from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars for swine producers. Join us on this small group and go to the next level of swine nutrition on this 7-week-long elite online training in applied swine nutrition and feeding by myself and my world-class invited speakers. Additionally, you enjoy an exclusive community to exchange ideas. Go now to www.eliteswinenutritionist.com.